The world knows the crucifixion. Almost no one knows what happened before it. In the hours leading up to the execution, two legal systems, one of the most sophisticated in antiquity and the most powerful in the Roman world, were bent, twisted, and deliberately broken, not out of ignorance, by design. The most documented trial in ancient history was, technically, the most illegal that ever existed. To understand the full weight of what happened, you first need to understand the setting. Jerusalem in the month of Nisan in the year 33 was not an ordinary city on an ordinary day. During the Jewish Passover, the permanent population of approximately 60,000 inhabitants found itself submerged beneath a wave that historians estimate at between 200,000 and 300,000 pilgrims from across the entire Mediterranean basin, from Babylon, Egypt, Asia Minor, Rome. The temple functioned as a machine of absolute precision during those days, processing tens of thousands of sacrifices within a matter of hours. Any threat to that mechanism was an existential threat, not merely religious, but economic, political, and existential in terms of identity. It is within this context that you must place what is about to happen, not as an isolated religious episode, as a first-order political crisis. Religious power in Jerusalem was exercised by a body of 71 men known as the Sanhedrin, presided over by the high priest. That year, the high priest was named Joseph Bar Caiaphas, appointed by the Roman governor Valerius Gratus in the year 18 after Christ, and retained in office for 18 consecutive years. An extraordinarily long tenure that revealed his skill at navigating between the religious demands of his people and the political requirements of Rome. Caiaphas was, above all, an institutional survivor. And institutional survivors recognize existential threats well in advance. Parallel to religious power existed the military and administrative power of Rome, embodied in the figure of Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea since the year 26. Ancient sources, Philo of Alexandria and Flavius Josephus, describe an administrator marked by ongoing brutalities and executions without trial. A man who had provoked bloody riots by bringing military standards bearing the emperor's effigy into the holy city, who had diverted funds from the temple treasury to finance an aqueduct, who had massacred Galileans during an act of worship. Pilate was in a politically precarious situation. Any new disturbance in his province could cost him his post. These two men, Caiaphas and Pilate, were the axes around which the 6 trials would revolve, and neither of them was interested in justice. They were interested in survival. The night begins in the garden. The Garden of Gethsemane was located on the slope of the Mount of Olives, separated from the city by the Kidron Valley. It was a space regularly frequented by the group that followed Jesus of Nazareth, and that was precisely the problem. To reach that specific garden, at that specific hour, with that contingent of armed men, someone had provided precise information about habits and locations. Someone from within. The Gospel accounts describe a spira, a Roman cohort of up to 600 soldiers, accompanied by temple officers and carrying lanterns, torches, and weapons. The presence of Roman soldiers alongside temple guards from the moment of the arrest already indicates something that many analyses overlook. There had been cooperation between the two instances of power before the arrest. The operation was coordinated, planned, timed to take place during the feast, when the city was too crowded for any organized popular response to be possible. The detainee was led in chains across the valley, back inside the city walls. And the first stop was not the temple nor the palace of the serving high priest. It was the house of Annas. Annas, son of Seth, had been high priest between the years 6 and 15 after Christ, deposed by the Romans when the office began to be rotated for political convenience. But the authority of a former high priest never disappeared entirely in the eyes of Jewish religious tradition. Annas was the father of 5 men who served as high priests after him. and the father-in-law of the current high priest Caiaphas. He was, in practice, the patriarch of a priestly dynasty that had controlled the office for decades. The interrogation conducted by Annas violated Hebrew law already at this early stage. The Mishnah, the oral code of Jewish law, compiled in writing in the 2nd century, but reflecting earlier practices, established in its tractate Sanhedrin, that capital cases had to be conducted exclusively in the Lishkat Hagazit, the chamber of hewn stone located within the temple precinct. Not in private residences, not in private palaces in the middle of the night, in the space designated by law for that specific purpose. The house of Annas was not that space. What happened there had no legal basis whatsoever. It was an informal session, held at an improper venue, conducted by a man with no active judicial mandate, in the middle of the night, without a formally registered charge and without organized defense. When Jesus responded to the interrogation by saying that he had taught openly in the temple and in the synagogues, and that his listeners could testify to what he had said, one of the guards struck him across the face for answering the high priest with supposed insolence. The scene already foreshadowed the pattern that would repeat itself in the hours that followed. The accused, who exercises a legitimate procedural right, is physically punished for exercising that right. Annas sent the prisoner bound to Caiaphas. The second trial is where the legal violations begin to accumulate at a speed that leaves any legal analyst deeply uncomfortable. The assembly convened at the palace of Caiaphas was composed of scribes, elders, and members of the Sanhedrin. The session was presided over by Caiaphas himself, the high priest, who was simultaneously the principal organizer of the arrest and the presiding judge of the tribunal that would try the accused. The first violation was the hour. Mishnah Sanhedrin, 4th chapter, 1st paragraph, is textually explicit. Capital cases could be tried only during the day, opened during the day and closed during the day. Nocturnal trials, in cases involving life and death, were prohibited without exception. The reason articulated by rabbinic commentators was both philosophical and practical. Night disturbed judgment, created conditions for errors of perception and memory, and human life deserved all the clarity that only daylight could guarantee. That session began in the middle of the night and would be concluded before dawn. Every moment of it violated the first fundamental requirement of Jewish capital procedure. The second violation involved the location. The Lishkat Hagazit, the only legitimate seat of the Sanhedrin for capital cases, was located within the temple complex, whose gates closed at night. It was physically impossible to convene the Sanhedrin for a capital case in the temple after sunset. The meeting at the private house of Caiaphas was an improper venue for an additional reason as well. The third violation involved the calendar. The Mishnah explicitly prohibited capital trials on the eve of the Sabbath and on the eve of feast days. The trial was taking place on the night preceding Passover, a calendrical violation that the legal texts themselves identified as sufficient grounds for nullity. The fourth violation is perhaps the most revealing of the philosophical sophistication of the Hebrew legal system. The Mishnah established that a capital trial could not be concluded on the same day it had begun. The verdict of condemnation had to await at least one day, so that the judges could reflect, sleep, and consult one another outside the atmosphere of the courtroom. The Talmudic text is explicit. In a capital case, they acquit on the same day, but they only condemn on the following day. The reason was to protect the accused from collective impulsiveness and the emotional heat of the moment. The midnight session violated this principle deliberately. The fifth violation touched on the process of gathering testimony, the heart of any trial under Hebrew law. Deuteronomy 17 verse 6 and Mishnah Sanhedrin in multiple passages established that capital cases required at minimum 2 witnesses whose accounts agreed in all relevant details. Any discrepancy between testimonies rendered both invalid and, under certain conditions, exposed the witnesses themselves to punishment for false testimony. The accounts of Matthew and Mark describe how many came forward with false testimony, but that their accounts diverged from one another. 2 witnesses claimed to have heard the accused threaten to destroy the temple, but their depositions did not agree in the details. By the criterion of the very law that the Sanhedrin represented, that was the procedurally mandatory moment to close the trial for lack of evidence. Without valid and concordant testimonies, there was no legal basis for continuation. The accused would be released. Caiaphas did not close the proceedings. The high priest took a step that was itself an additional procedural violation of extreme gravity. He rose to his feet, a gesture of psychological pressure upon the other judges, and directly interrogated the accused about his own identity. Hebrew law protected every defendant from self-incrimination with remarkable clarity. The Talmudic maxim, Ein Adam Maisim Atzmo Rasha, no man can render himself guilty by his own words, protected the accused from being condemned on the basis of statements he made about himself, especially under coercion and threat. Caiaphas built the entire condemnation on precisely what the law prohibited. The accused's response was used as the basis for tearing his own garments in a gesture of ritualized indignation, and for declaring that the tribunal no longer needed witnesses. The vote that followed brought a 7th violation of the greatest philosophical significance. The Mishnah established that in capital cases, the voting had to begin with the youngest members of the tribunal and proceed from the least experienced to the most senior, protecting younger judges from the influence of their more experienced peers. Even more significant, the Mishnah contained a principle that should, by its own terms, have resulted in immediate acquittal. A unanimous guilty verdict in a capital case was grounds for automatic acquittal. The logic was precise. An accused with no defender in the tribunal, with not a single voice in his defense among 71 judges, was probably the victim of collective bias or political orchestration. Unanimity was suspect. A tribunal that votes as a bloc against a single man is not deliberating. It is executing. The records suggest the condemnation was virtually unanimous. By the logic of the very law that the Sanhedrin represented, that unanimity should have resulted in immediate acquittal. What followed was documented by all 3 synoptic evangelists with converging details. The accused was spat upon, struck across the face with fists, with his face covered as they hit him and taunted him to guess who had struck him. It was brutality carried out inside the palace of the high priest, in the darkest hours of the night, by men who belonged to the apparatus of the highest religious authority of the nation. The 3rd trial took place as the sky began to lighten over the hills of Judea. At dawn, the Sanhedrin convened a formal meeting. The texts of Matthew, Mark, and Luke converge in recording this 2nd gathering of the tribunal as a distinct morning session separate from the nocturnal one. The purpose was transparent: to confer the appearance of legality upon a condemnation produced under conditions of flagrant illegality. Luke is the most detailed. The tribunal assembled, repeated the central interrogation about the identity of the accused, received the answer, and declared that it had heard enough. The session was closed in a remarkably short time. The attempt at retroactive legitimization was legally insufficient for 2 fundamental reasons. First, because the morning ratification did not cure the original defects. In law, a process vitiated at its origin is not healed by subsequent confirmations. Second, because the Sanhedrin had lost, under Roman domination, the right to carry out capital punishment. The Talmudic tractate Sanhedrin records this loss. 40 years before the destruction of the temple, the right of capital judgment was taken from Israel. If the Sanhedrin had no power of execution, the entire operation since midnight had produced only a condemnation without the one power that would have made it consequential. To kill, they needed Pilate. The transfer to Roman jurisdiction immediately generated one of the most documented ironies of the entire proceeding. The Praetorium, the Roman administrative headquarters in Jerusalem during Passover, most likely the palace of Herod the Great, was Gentile territory. Entering Gentile territory during Passover week would render any observant Jew ritually impure. The very members of the Sanhedrin who had just violated at least 7 procedural provisions of the law they administered refused to cross the threshold of the Praetorium so as not to contract ritual impurity. Men who had turned every procedural precept of the law into a dead letter stopped at a doorstep to preserve their ceremonial purity. The fourth trial began with Pilate stepping out into the outer courtyard. The prefect of Judea asked what charge they brought against the man. The reply was evasive. If he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him over to you. It was not a formal accusation. There was no libellus, the written document that standard Roman procedure required. Pilate perceived immediately that he was facing an internal religious dispute dressed in the language of public security, and his response was direct. Let them judge the man according to their own law. The religious leaders needed Pilate precisely because their own law could not execute anyone. They reformulated their accusations in political terms calculated to force the prefect's hand. The man had subverted the nation, opposed the payment of tribute to Caesar, and claimed the title of king. Any claim to kingship in Roman imperial territory was, by legal definition, treason against the emperor. Pilate took the accused inside the Praetorium for private interrogation. When he came out, his statement was the first of 3 he would make over the hours that followed. I find no guilt in this man. 3 declarations of innocence pronounced by the magistrate responsible for the trial. The legal weight of this fact within the Roman legal system cannot be overstated. The prefect was not a replaceable functionary. He was the holder of the imperium, the absolute sovereign authority within his jurisdiction. When a holder of the imperium declared a man innocent, that declaration had the force of law. The fundamental principle of Roman criminal procedure was that the innocent could not be condemned. There was no Roman legal structure that permitted a judge to condemn a man he himself had declared innocent 3 times. The mention that the accused was a Galilean offered Pilate what appeared to be an elegant way out. Herod Antipas, Tetrarch of Galilee, was in Jerusalem during the feast. Transferring the case to his jurisdiction would be procedurally defensible and would allow Pilate to distance himself from a cause he clearly did not want to judge. The 5th trial lasted briefly and produced nothing of legal relevance. Herod Antipas was the same man who had ordered John the Baptist beheaded without trial, motivated by a reckless promise made at a banquet. The text of Luke records that he was very glad to see the accused because he had long wished to see him, drawn by reports of wonders. Herod was not interested in conducting a trial. He was interested in entertainment. He interrogated the accused with many questions. The accused answered none of them. Herod and his soldiers dressed him in a splendid robe as a gesture of mockery and returned him to Pilate without sentence, without formal charge, without any legal pronouncement of any kind. The 5th trial was a deliberate farce, but its political consequence was not trivial. Luke records that on that day Herod and Pilate became friends, for before they had been at enmity with each other. The most corrupted judicial process of antiquity had served as an instrument of political reconciliation between 2 rival rulers. The life of a man declared innocent was used as diplomatic currency. The 6th trial was the longest, the most theatrical, and the only one that produced a formal condemnation. Pilate convened the chief priests, the rulers, and the people and presented his conclusion once more. He had interrogated the accused, Herod had done the same, and neither of them had found anything that warranted death. He proposed that the man be punished and released. The institution of the Passover pardon, the release of a prisoner at the prefect's discretion during the feast, was not written into any legal code. It was custom, not law. And as custom, its meaning depended entirely on how it was used. Pilate used it as an exit, but the exit was blocked. The religious leaders had already prepared the crowd to demand Barabbas, a man involved in sedition and murder. The choice presented was between a man condemned for documented violent crimes and a man declared innocent 3 times by the Roman magistrate himself. The crowd chose Barabbas. Pilate then ordered the accused to be flogged, which in itself was an additional violation of Roman law. The principle that physical torture could not be applied to defendants not yet condemned was established in Roman law, particularly for free persons. The flogging here carried the character of a preemptive punishment, applied with the hope that the sight of the beaten man would satisfy the crowd and generate pressure for clemency. It was penal policy being used as an instrument of public theatre. The Roman flagellation bore no resemblance to the punishment of 40 stripes less, one that Jewish law prescribed to preserve the life of the condemned. The Roman flagellum was a leather instrument with fragments of metal, bone and lead tied to its strips. There was no limit on the number of blows. There was no limit on duration. The medical and historical records that modern anatomists have consulted in studying this period are uniform. A severe flagellation frequently led to death before any subsequent execution. The man presented to the crowd in the gesture that John records as "Behold the man" was in all probability near the extreme limits of human physical endurance. Pilate declared for the 3rd time that he found no crime in him. The response was the cry for crucifixion, and then the accusers employed the argument Pilate feared most. If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. The expression amicus Caesaris and friend of Caesar was not mere flattery. It was a formal title, a designation of status within the imperial hierarchy that conferred protection and access. To lose that status, or to have it challenged through a formal denunciation to the emperor, was the beginning of the end for any official. Pilate knew that his position in Judea was precarious. Tiberius was an emperor who had exiled and executed officials for lesser offenses. A formal denunciation of a prefect who had released a man claiming Jewish kingship was sufficient documentation to destroy what remained of an already compromised career. Pilate called for water. He washed his hands before the crowd in a gesture of Jewish origin, adopted by a Roman as a public declaration of non-responsibility. He sat on the tribunal, on the stone pavement that John calls in Greek the lithostrotos, and in Aramaic the Gabbatha, and pronounced the sentence of death by crucifixion. A man declared innocent 3 times by his own judge was condemned by that same judge. The sentence was pronounced and executed on the same day, without formal appeal, without a period of reflection, without the interval that either of the 2 legal systems required. The analysis of the 12 hours separating the arrest in the garden from the sentence at the lithostrotos reveals an architecture of deliberate illegality at every stage. These were not errors committed by men who did not know the rules. The Sanhedrin was composed of the most learned interpreters of Jewish law of their generation, and they chose to ignore every rule systematically because the speed and secrecy of the operation were more important than the integrity of the process. The illegal session at the house of Annas set the tone. The nocturnal session at the house of Caiaphas produced the informal condemnation. The morning session attempted to cover the nocturnal condemnation with a veneer of form. The transfer to Pilate attempted to cover the inadequacy of the Jewish condemnation with the weight of Roman authority. The transfer to Herod diluted responsibility. The return to Pilate ended with a condemnation that the judge himself had declared unjust 3 times before pronouncing it. The law professor Simon Greenleaf of Harvard University, who in the 19th century produced one of the most influential treatises on the evaluation of legal evidence, catalogued the violations in systematic order and reached the conclusion that there was not a single fundamental principle of either of the 2 legal systems that had not been violated at least once over the course of those 12 hours. The jurist Walter M. Chandler, in a 2-volume treatise published in 1916, identified 27 distinct procedural violations with precise source and chapter references. Scholars of Roman law arrived at similar counts when examining the case exclusively through the lens of imperial law. The inscription placed above the instrument of execution, written in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek, the 3 languages of power in that Mediterranean space, read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Pilate had ordered it written thus. When the chief priests protested and asked that it be written instead that the man had merely claimed to be king, Pilate refused, the only time in those hours that he refused a request from the religious leaders who had gotten everything they had asked for. "What I have written, I have written." It was a phrase too short to be policy and too long to be bureaucracy. It was a man who had yielded on everything that mattered, recording in 3 languages and in permanent form his own account of what had happened. What those 12 hours reveal, above all else, is the anatomy of power when it feels threatened. Caiaphas was not protecting the law. He was protecting an institution that the law was meant to serve. The threat was not to the faith of the people. It was to the structure of authority upon which he himself depended for his existence. Pilate was not administering justice. He was managing calculated political risk in units of bureaucratic survival. Each of the 3 declarations of innocence he pronounced was an attempt to place on record his awareness of the situation without paying the cost of acting in accordance with that awareness. Herod was not judging. He was being entertained by something that cost him nothing and which he converted into diplomatic currency. 3 distinct forms of authority, 3 entirely distinct motivations, a single direction of outcome. Scholars of political science and constitutional theory use this trial to this day as a case study on the concept of institutional capture, the phenomenon by which structures created to protect the individual against the arbitrariness of power are inverted and begin to serve the very system they were supposed to control. The Sanhedrin existed to protect the law of God against the power of men. On that night, it was used to protect the power of a group of men against the inconvenience of the law of God. The Praetorium existed to guarantee order and justice in conquered territory. On that morning, it was used to transform an internal religious dispute into a politically convenient execution. What happened in Jerusalem in the year 33 was not a historical exception produced by an extraordinary confluence of circumstances. It was the most documented example of a phenomenon that would repeat itself. In other courts, in other cities, with other accused, under other legal systems, with a regularity that 2 millennia of history have recorded with sufficient clarity that scholars in Harvard, Oxford, Jerusalem, and Rome still analyze it under the same categories. The difference is that this time, the accused entered that process knowing exactly what was being constructed and offered no defense.